Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And we're going to hit on a lot of those today with my guest, Mark Nelson. He's a return guest on the Power Hungry Podcast. Mark, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast for the second time.
Thanks, Robert. Good to be here.
I have my guests introduce themselves. So I could say you're the managing director at the Radiant Energy Fund, but if you don't mind, give us 30 or 45 seconds of an intro, even though you've been on the podcast before.
Sure. I work to save nuclear plants and to expand them around the world. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure people know what the best energy source is and how to save it and how to build it. That's what I do.
Good. That was nice and short. So you've just come back from Europe. You were there for several weeks. I think you've been back now less than 2 weeks. What did you see? What's going on? I mean, this energy crisis, and it is a crisis, it seems to be sweeping across Europe. What's happening and why?
So first of all, there was almost nothing to see because at least when I was there 2 weeks ago, almost nobody had any awareness of what was coming. There's been 20, 30, 40 years of complacency, and people were I think they're just sleepwalking at the moment. Now, there have been a few very big wake-up calls since I've been at home. For one, they started running out of gasoline, diesel, petrol in the UK. That itself is not the same thing as the energy crisis that's going to be hitting in a few months, whenever the cold weather hits in the UK. But it was a sign that something is going wrong, something is going weird. And since petrol is an important precursor to all manner of services in the UK, it was one of the first drops of water coming from the sky as the hurricane approaches, I would say.
Well, so you said that 30 or 40 years of complacency. Explain that. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. Energy was easy. New energy producers were getting up to speed. Energy investors were losing their shirt all around the world by expanding production too fast and too hard. The gas flowed cheap. The coal flowed easy, only shut off by a need to decarbonize at the national level for many countries around the world. Nuclear was already built. People weren't building much more. The nuclear plants were getting better and better in operation every year. That made, while the power was coming in, it made it seem like energy was easy, and the only problem was how to turn off the nuclear, build the renewables, and coast on the existing fossil fuel infrastructure.
Well, let me hit on that center point. The one you hit in the middle there was, build renewables. But from everything that I see, this whole idea of building renewables in Europe is encountering huge amounts of friction. And in fact, it appears in Germany to be stopped in its tracks. Is that the case?
Yeah, but the folks who know that don't even seem to be heads of state. It's lower level ministry officials in charge of quote unquote energy transition. So the fact that countries around Europe are especially the ones that are anti-nuclear are barely building, say, wind turbines anymore. That's not popularly known. Certainly the press doesn't really know. And if heads of state know, it's just until they've run out of energy, it's been a much smaller issue than any other thing that might be pressing. Immigration, climate change conferences, organic agriculture. There's a number of things that just were more important than energy when energy was easy. You know the old joke about sex being like oxygen, no big deal till you don't get any of it? Well, turns out electricity is very close to oxygen, and we don't need a joke. If the electricity is the oxygen, it's the respiration process of society, and we're going to run things really close to the metal this year across Europe.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I was in Louisiana a couple weeks ago, seeing people queue up for gasoline to run their small generators, and I'm paraphrasing Roger Pilkey's Iron Law of Climate, but I'm calling it Bryce's Iron Law of Electricity, which is people and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need, and that's sure it looks exactly like. Go ahead.
The difference here is not all of them are gonna succeed necessarily. Like not all of them are gonna jerk back into shape, find the fossil fuels they need since they haven't built an alternative to what fossil fuels provide, and then reduce electricity by enough and survive the storm. Only some countries are gonna make that really big transition and exit the other side with a better system. I mean, the canonical example here for me, for all of us in the nuclear movement, is France. France went through a crunch. Unlike other countries in Europe, they did not have ready access to tons and tons of fossil fuels, especially for domestic electricity production. And they didn't have the escape valve that a country like Norway did, where you just have a bunch of fjords and you just dam them up. France had to build nuclear. It happened to make them rich without fossil fuels in the electricity sector.
So if I can interrupt, just because, it was in 73, it was after the first oil shock, right? And France, their electric sector was particularly dependent on oil, right? And oil quadruples in price. If memory serves, they were something like 80% dependent on electricity derived from oil. And so they were facing a societal, well, not a collapse, but just a crunch, like far worse than what was the case in the U.S.
And by the way, I'm going to stop my story there because you brought up something interesting. Oil for electricity is something done in almost no major European country or anywhere in the US. You're about to see it come back in a big way in Europe this winter. Because at the moment, on a BTU basis, natural gas is trading at a much higher cost than oil.
Right.
Now, it's trading at an extraordinary high cost that would make the idea of just producing electricity at that rate, the fuel cost, just incredible. Some of the numbers I've seen in the last week, just flipping by as energy traders on Twitter, just can't believe what they're seeing. They're seeing things that have never been seen. They're seeing things like gas trading at the equivalent of $170 per barrel, Brent crude.
Right.
And at that price for gas, you might as well just dump liquids into turbines if it'll burn and just burn it.
Sure. So we're seeing, it's an interesting point that you make, because I think that's definitely the case. And Goldman Sachs has made some estimates that electric generation from oil is going to increase global demand at least 1 million barrels a day. And they're revising it upward. So we're seeing kind of a return to the past in this regard, right? For the U.S.
Yes, we call this an energy transition. First, you start depending on natural flows like wind and solar, and then you transition to oil that comes out of the ground. You find it in buckets, and you dump it in your barrel to burn it. That's where we are in Europe in terms of energy policy, which is to say it's not an energy transition. It's an energy cycle, an energy resurrection.
Energy regression. Would that be fair? Or what was the word
it
you used?
It depends. Moving from wind to oil in some ways is a return to highly available on-demand energy. Is that good or bad, depending on whether you're trying to keep a grid afloat as a grid operator in Europe this winter.
And they need to do that at all costs, because
turns out yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Turns out that no matter what any country says about decarbonization, if they did not replace coal and gas with nuclear, they're going to move back to whatever can be burned whenever a calm spell hits Europe, which was most of this late summer and into the autumn. It's just still.
Well, you made some interesting point. I think it was, I don't know if it was on Twitter. And by the way, I'm talking to Mark Nelson. He's on Twitter. He wants me to refer you to @EnergyBants is his Twitter handle. You made a point recently that all of these energy models and energy modelers, and you and I know who they are, high profile academics at elite universities, putting out sophisticated, very complex models about moving the entire energy and power sectors to all renewables. What did you say about them? These wind droughts that have hit Europe. What are they going to have to do to make their models true up, given what we're seeing?
Well, so let me just say a general thing about energy modeling, or about academia in general.
Sure.
To academics, there's no difference between academia and the real world. In the real world, there is. That's an asymmetry. It's not a parallel. It's not an even relationship between the two things. Sometimes the real world's right and academics are wrong, and sometimes academics are right and the reality's wrong. I was in Tallinn, Estonia a few days ago, and I watched a debate between a gentleman from the Green Party and a gentleman trying to set up a nuclear plant in Estonia. And it was in Estonian. I couldn't really participate. That's not one of my 2 languages that I know. And afterwards, I talked with the gentleman. He was from the Green Party, big scholarly looking dude, professor type. He had a big beard, looked to be about 60, 65. I said to him, there's an energy crisis in Europe because a lot of wind turbines were built and they're not producing, meaning it has to be made up for by natural gas. And he said, that's not true. Wind comes and goes, but on average, it averages out. And I said, no, on average, across the entirety of continental Europe, it's down 20% at least this year. In some highly wind-dependent regions, Robert, I checked the numbers and I was off. In Scotland, some of the big renewable companies are reporting a third less generation. A third. Some of that from equipment, but the vast majority of it from just there being not enough wind over the course of an entire year at nation scales. Right. So I say to this gentleman in Tallinn, I say, wind is down 20%. It's already happened. How can you say that's not the fault of wind? And he said, it's impossible. And I said, what? And he said, do you know how I know? I have a PhD in atmospheric sciences. So we had a professor being told that the data is already in. This isn't an experiment. This isn't a model. Already this year, across the entire year through October 1st, wind is down 20% at least in the major European economies. And so he said, no, it's impossible because I have a PhD.
So doesn't this put to lie this whole idea that we've heard this over and over? Well, one, we can go all renewable, right? That this broad claim, right, that's made by some of the biggest environmental groups in the country, and Sierra Club is one of them, Natural Resource Defense Company, you know all these. But that the claim has been, the wind is always blowing somewhere. So if only we have enough transmission.
He said that literally in an Estonian accent in very good English. He said the wind is always blowing somewhere.
Right.
But think about this, just on a basic physical level. If the wind is not blowing in one unit of space, let's call that area A, then by definition, unit area B is not blowing into it or receiving it from A. Meaning you have calmness that, again, I'm not an atmospheric sciences person, but this is just I was a bit of a math nerd. This is just some basic vector field stuff, Robert. The wind has to blow to somewhere from somewhere. And if it's not blowing somewhere, it's not blowing from somewhere, right?
Well, I suppose I'm not sure I'm following you here, but wherever it may be blowing somewhere may be so far from where you at that it doesn't make any difference. So.
And here's the really important part. In the real world, we worry about risk. We worry about the exact time events occur, the sequence in which events occur. Right. So if you plan to survive for an entire year and somebody says you should be able to, in fact, we can ensure that your heart will beat 99.9% of the year. If that 0.1% of the year that your heart doesn't beat comes on January 1st, you're not making it to January 2nd. Now, even though on average your heart works really well, or on average for the whole year you're going to have enough food, but there's a month in the middle where you won't have any. Or let's do another example.
Sure.
The resolution to a number of supposed paradoxes about the payoff from gambling approaches, like the martingale strategy, where you just double or nothing every time until you win. How can you lose, right? It's because in the real world, you bomb out. In the real world, you go bust. And then you don't get to participate in the next round. You don't participate in the next round of gambling. You don't participate in the next round of having your grid on if in Texas in February it goes too low during 1 second. During 1 second, if it falls way too low and the turbines trip at the big plants and you've already shut off all the optional circuits, you don't get to go into the next round and say, well, let's run it back, boys, and see if we do better the next second. You have to make it work continuously in every second to make it to the next second. This is the fundamental difference between in the energy models, where if they do model runs and they do thousands of runs, millions of runs or whatever, they see that as showing a bigger paper or more results or more robustness. They don't see it as the model seeking the exact backward looking thing that happens to have made it work. Now, this is something that happens all the time in the finance community, where people make sophisticated models, they backfit, they back test to see if it worked with the prices that would have been seen.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that works with the prices that will go. And the more optimized, finely tuned, or fragile your model is by not having a giant supply of huge option value waiting, you could turn on that bank of plants or this bank of plants or have this combination of failures happen, and it doesn't matter because you've got giant backup. They see diminishing that and optimizing that and having their model barely survive it, they see that as a good thing. In the real world, when margins get lean, and real live business people know that when margins get lean, uncertainty starts to dominate your thinking, and the ability to survive and stay liquid or keep the grid up, that starts to lead to incredibly weird and difficult decision making that can go wrong. And
Well,
combined with whatever weather event is forcing it, that's the difference between the real world and the models. What we're seeing now is not the lights going out in Europe. What we're seeing now is some crazy things happening before the lights go out.
Well, so let's bring it back to Europe, because I obviously touched a nerve on the model side for you.
Yeah,
there.
I've got a lot of thoughts. I think the basic thing is they don't read my shit tweets, but I read their work. So there's another asymmetry there.
Fair enough. So, but these natural gas prices, this is one of the things. Well, you know Meredith Angwin and her work, The Fatal Trifecta, right? This idea that, and it seems to me that this is what is playing out in Europe in real time, which is over-reliance, particularly in Britain, over-reliance on imports. And I want you to talk about the fire on the electric line between Britain and France. Over-reliance on imports, just-in-time gas, and renewables. And it seems like this is exactly what is happening in Britain today, and it is causing havoc in both the natural gas markets and the electric markets. Talk about that.
Sure. So the UK went further than almost every other country in substituting markets, which it was a superior inventor and implementer of markets, right? The UK had a very large amount of pride over the last 40 years in being the best at implementing markets and running them successfully from London or whatever, and having British people have some of the highest levels of financial expertise and knowledge about markets in the world. They substitute a lot of boring, ugly, ideologically compromised state planning that would ensure that the state keeps going.
Right.
So Britain did more of that in other countries. The market recently decided that there wasn't enough value in storing natural gas in Britain on British soil for the main facility that supplied storage for Britain to function. And in the year that it went out of service, Rough, ROUGH is the name of the facility, the Rough facility, sure enough, the market was not awarding it enough revenue to justify continuing. Now, if you make your money in markets, the loss of Rough means volatility, because the just-in-timeness gets so severe in Britain now that because there's no countering high spot prices or high pipeline prices or high LNG prices with just a bunch of cheap gas coming from storage. Not cheap because it was cheap to run the storage facility necessarily and to buy the gas and to wait for the time to return it, but at the moment that the gas is already stored in the facility, it's very easy to enter it into the market grid, right? There's a difference. If we panic today, we can't go fill up that gas storage facility on a moment's notice and say, okay, we're running it back. We're going to do this model run again one more time with the storage facility, right? So if you're in trading, the high volatility is just more ways to make money with both upside and downside. So if you've got trading mentality at the top of the state, you don't have to deal with the physical going bust that you do when you're thinking about it as like a planning thing, like what happens in an emergency. And so therefore your appreciation of tail events just rots, because you can always go bankrupt. It's just that now bankruptcy is redefined as the physical ability of the industrial systems of the UK to continue operating. That's what bankruptcy means now, if they bust out of the natural gas and electricity markets.
Right, and the potential for people to freeze to death this winter because they don't have enough gas. So, what I'm hearing you say, and this is part of what we saw here in Texas, is we'll trust the market. This deregulatory atmosphere that we'll let the market. We don't need all this regulation. We don't need the regulators to keep close tabs on the utilities. We'll let the utilities all figure it out. And now we're seeing, as we did in Texas, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, in Britain, some of these retailers that were providing energy, that are electricity or gas, they're going bust. We're seeing the gritty effect from Texas transferred to Britain. Am I missing something?
Yeah, no, gritty came from the idea, the concept. It came from Britain. It's not that it was invented in Texas. Britain is the one that developed all that. You know, there's some killer quotes in an article I read a number of years ago with a gentleman, I think he's on the political left, analyzing how almost all of Britain's key infrastructure got sold off to often state companies of other states.
Uh-huh.
And Britain was like, let's privatize. And then it was owned by the state controlled entities of other states. Is that privatization or is it not? Hard to say, right?
Well,
so
is
for
this-
example, the British nuclear fleet got
Right.
sold off to the state nuclear company of France, right?
Right.
They just took down the British nuclear signs and put up EDF Energy. I've been to the engineering headquarters. I was gonna go work for them. And it was like Brits who were like, yeah, we're sort of owned by French people now. Awkward. But if that's what the market says and that nobody else bid on your crumbly old nuclear plants, then that's what you do, right? Well, when Margaret Thatcher was told that you could privatize electricity, make all these companies that like competed against each other to sell brands of electricity to the public, she says, you can't exactly have different companies selling electricity. And people were like, no, you can actually. And they convinced her. She left office. By 1997, under her successor, John Major, they had set up an electricity market, one of the very first in the world. And that's when the rot started.
Well, that's interesting. So that was 97 and Texas deregulated in 2001. So this
A lot of times it was the same law firms, the same dudes, the same professors giving testimony. It was just this creeping cancer that spread across the world. In 2000, it didn't look like a cancer. You know, sure, you had a little blip, Enron in California, but what's a giant blackout and a massive cost increase and companies going bust everywhere among friends? It's just our power grid, Rob. You know, it's just a little electricity. But that kept going, and it kept going, and eventually what happened was you divide out all the public good attributes and dump them on certain entities, and you carve out the stuff where temporarily people can make money doing it. Then when companies can no longer make money building the power plant, they just don't. They just stop. That's what happened in Britain. They just stopped building power plants because they're like, oh, market says it's not worth it anymore.
Right. And there was no reward. So let me let me stop you, because what I'm hearing you say, what is rhyming in my head here, is this is a government failure. Is that right? Is that how you see it?
Sure. The thing is, I don't really care whether your power plants get built with socialism, capitalism, communism, whatever. It's the foundational basis for everything else that will happen in your economy.
And yet there was not an understanding, and I think this is the same thing we saw here in Texas, not an understanding of just how critical the network is. So
it was somebody else's problem, and somebody else was paying. And they believed these dumb professors who had never run a factory or anything in their life, where uncertainty is dominant, information asymmetries dominate, where the system does okay for 10 years, then fails all at once, then blows up all at once. They didn't, you know, the idea was, if you know economics, there's no such thing as knowing what a power plant is. It's all just something to marketize, and that you simply alter the market rules to fit maybe some weird aspects of electricity or some weird aspects of power plants.
Well, let me interrupt there, because it seems like that's exactly what I've thought here in Texas, is this idea, oh, we're going to sell electricity like a commodity. Well, no, it's not a commodity. It's a service. It's a service, and the same could be said of the flow of natural gas. So, where is Europe now? Which countries are doing better than others? Is France in demonstrably better shape than Britain? Who's in the worst shape?
So what's weird about France is the way the electricity markets were set up.
And by the way, and I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you now, again, I know, but you went to how many countries? You were in Europe for what, 2 or 3 weeks just in the last month or so? Where all did you go?
I headed to Germany first to participate in the final of a series of 6 demonstrations outside of the nuclear plants, each of which displaces a colossal amount of gas and coal. And you'll hear what's about to happen in Germany. But I went to Augsburg, Germany, where nearby the Gundremmingen C nuclear plant is more than 1,300 megawatts, incredible sterling operational record, and is going to be shut down in a few weeks, straight into the highest CO2, coal, and gas prices on record.
They're going to shut it down. I didn't even know this. They're shutting it down in the next few weeks, even amid the crisis?
Well, Robert, are you going to come report live from Berlin November 13th?
No, November 13th is the shutdown date?
No, November 13th is the day we intervene to make sure it doesn't get shut down.
Okay. Gotcha. But so I didn't know about
December
that planned shutdown.
31st, maybe on the stroke of midnight, because the most powerful carbon-free, fuel-free generating facilities in Germany become worthless 1 hour after midnight on December 31st, you see.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow you there. The fuel-free.
They set up the closure dates on the nuclear plants to be extremely back heavy, where they're shutting down in a matter of months, almost the same amount of power output over the course of a year that they've shut down progressively one reactor at a time since Fukushima.
So how many megawatts are we talking about here?
Well, 8.4, 8.5 gigawatts.
8.5 gigawatts.
They're really good units at this point, and they're very good at load following, and they're very cheap. I mean, the problem is they picked off all the weak ones first, the weak nuclear plants. They're only left with the absolute superstar, best performing, highest producing nuclear plants on planet Earth. That's what they're left with.
Well, this just seems like, so as you're saying this, I mean, this is incredible. I've been trying to follow I've been traveling, doing some other things, but I've been trying to follow this. This just seems like societal suicide, that this is some kind of a purposeful deindustrialization of Europe, with Germany leading the way, even though Germany has been the industrial heartland of Europe for decades. I mean, this, as you're telling me this, I'm sitting here almost stupefied that this is happening.
Look, I've talked to reporters who interviewed me in Brussels because of the Stand Up Brussels, and they said, "Oh, don't worry, Germany wouldn't commit suicide. I'm sure we'll find a way to keep the plants on." Then I talked to people actually in the nuclear industry, and they're like, "No, we literally won't have staffing or even enough people to run the plant after that hour."
And we're talking about,
okay.
And we're talking about over the next, we're beginning of October. You're talking about in November and December, the next 60 days. 8 gigawatts of German nuclear?
It's split in half. 8.5 are shut down by December 31st, 2022, of which exactly half are to be shut down by December 31st, 2001.
2021.
Yes.
Okay, so we're looking at 4.5 gigawatts, 4 gigawatts between now and the end of 21. And even though there was a headline today I saw that one German power plant is out of coal, they just shut it down. They can't
not
get
brown coal, not the dirty stuff that you dig out from a giant pit under villages. They're out of the black coal that now that they shut their black coal mines, they have to import.
So they're out of gas, they're out of coal, and
they're not necessarily out of gas.
Okay,
I'm sure Russia, beyond the contracts that's already scheduled, if Russia's going to send more gas, I bet it's going to be to Germany to cement that lovely relationship of perfect equality represented by Nord Stream 2.
Because they have such a good history, the Germans and the Russians together, right? Yeah.
The Russians have often enjoyed advancing into Berlin. Yes.
I wrote this down. So are there any other countries that are doing better? I mean, you mentioned, we talked about France. Is France in a relatively good position?
France is looking really pretty now because although their electricity wholesale price is high, almost none of that represents an increase in costs. This is complicated. Electricity markets are so complicated that electricity experts no longer understand them, and electricity traders no longer understand behaviors as renewables increase. If the traders themselves cannot understand, there's only a certain number of people dumb enough or rich enough to keep subsidizing the system by losing money against in the US, in the US, the trading is so complicated, the systems interfaces are so complicated that the markets themselves are rewriting rules constantly, burning traders who made money and then going back and saying, nope, we made a computer error during that hour, so we're going to take it back. And they're getting weirder and weirder and weirder. I see energy traders who have made a pretty penny knowing exactly how to play the utilities off each other, the customers off each other, the slow people, the dumb, the new mini Enrons, right?
Right.
Doing a great job making money. Not saying they're dishonest, they just make a good money to buy and sell electricity contracts. They say things like, I have no clue what's going on in Texas and it's only September. That is going on many places because of the erratic and crazy nature of the just-in-time gas plus the maybe there, maybe not renewables, plus the weird way that the grid is wearing out unevenly and in different patterns under the strain of highly fluctuating loads and supplies, right? This brings us back to something you asked for that I didn't talk about.
Okay.
Import of electricity into Britain through interconnectors.
Right.
The market did not distinguish between an interconnector and a power plant in Britain. The market designers were saying, if it's a gigawatt, it's a gigawatt. What's the difference? It's like saying that, it's like when, who was it? Harold Macmillan was an old Tory, a stodgy old man with a big mustache and cigar, and he was an old Tory, and he was uncomfortable with what Thatcher was doing in Britain with just saying that a pound is a pound, whether it's coming from a London banker or a factory up north, right?
Right.
So the UK was making its decisions on whether or not to reinvest, to scale up their factories, power plants, etc., to keep up with the level of the Germanys and Japans of the world, right?
Right.
That's what was under question. And if so, whose money and how? Thatcher was saying the market is indicating that we're best at activity B, not activity A. And then Harold Macmillan would say something like, sure looks like we're selling off the family silver. And then the Tory party would go, oh, how could you say that? You don't understand. You're this foolish old man. And he said, hey, all I know is that in my day, back in the 30s or 40s, there's a lot of young men who didn't see a difference between their own resources and credit until they blew up. But then you could always retire them to a stable, out-of-the-way country seat, and you didn't have to have them in London anymore. That's all I was saying. I'll just shut up now. Then Thatcher herself thought that the electricity markets were crazy. They convinced her otherwise. She left office. Her successors put into place. And at the time, it seemed like it was delivering so many benefits. Robert, how awesome that the consumer of Britain can save a ton of money by just importing cheap extra power from France instead of having your own power plant.
But now that's
fuel, has to have labor, it might have labor unions, it might have glitches, construction. Oh, it's just so complicated. Better to let a country with a comparative advantage in getting shit done, France, which is, that's saying something, but France built the power plants and had the extra power because they built too many, which is what energy economists told me as a young, stupid grad student. They said, oh, France built way too many power plants. It's important to shut them down so they don't have too much. Right. So that was the attitude in France, where in Britain they said, oh, let's just import it from France. But then something happened a few weeks ago while I was in Europe. I was staying at the house of our dear movement ally, Bjorn Peters, and I got some notice, oh, there was a fire in the British side terminal for where the 2 gigawatt power line comes in. They lost 1 gigawatt of power, and they expect it to be gone until the weather clears up again in March of next year.
So they're looking at 6 months of potential electricity shortages, and at the same time they're looking at gas shortages.
It should be fine, Robert, because the Central Electricity Generating Board back in the 70s was severely overbuilding way too many power plants, costing consumers 20% too much because they had just a bit more and it wasn't optimized like a market would. Well, the market optimized Britain all the way down to not having enough power plants. And it's very efficient because it means each power plant now makes a lot more money, which is what a market should be designed to do, right?
Well, so let me interrupt you then. So, because what I'm hearing you say is this is the revenge of the markets, and the revenge of the markets is going to take a deadly swipe at a lot of people's money, at a lot of people's wallets. So what's the cure here? Is there a cure, and how long is it going to take?
My impression is that the issue is beyond just saying money and wallets in Britain. Money and wallets in Germany, money and wallets in France, money and wallets in Netherlands. The issue is beyond, at this point, money and wallets in Britain. They're going to have different issues. Money, what is money? Money is debt. Debt is what you can pay back, and what you can pay back cannot be linked to whether the weather is good or not, right? In the most basic sense, the quality of a currency, the quality of somebody's word is based on them being able to deliver. At the moment, what we're going to find is that when you set up enough of your economy to be based on the weather, a bunch of people have to break their promises. When enough people have to break their promises because the weather didn't come in, you lose the ability to even talk in terms of costs and prices that are based on what people owe each other when they know they can deliver and the weather doesn't matter.
Wait a
Now,
minute. I just want to be clear about what you're talking. We're talking about the weather. You're talking about the ability of wind turbines to produce electricity.
I'm talking about the ability of a £1 note to mean the same thing one year that it did the last, even though the weather was bad.
Okay, but I'm trying to link this back to where we were with the energy part of this. You lost me there.
Britain doesn't know whether basic things are going to happen this winter, much less next year. They are shutting down fertilizer plants, for example.
Yeah. Well,
and you know what fertilizer makes? It makes
right.
to where you can be pretty sure within certain bounds of weather that the crops will come in, which is not, that's a modern privilege. We didn't have the ability to make sure the crops came in the past. Britain would go through famines followed by plague. You know, it's just a whole thing. And that came from an inability to get away from the weather.
So now with CF Industries, they've shut down two fertilizer plants in the UK. And I've talked to my friend John Harpel about this. We're looking at fertilizer shortages that then could, within a matter of months, maybe a year, we're going to see knock-on effects of potentially food shortages because we don't have enough hydrocarbons to make fertilizer. Am I missing something here?
I will say that the UK is one of the smallest major industrial nations by fertilizer generation because, well, its fertilizer dropped by about, 50% over the last 20 years. Its fertilizer production.
Uh-huh.
Why is that? Well, the market found better uses for British natural gas, electricity production.
Right.
Meanwhile, fertilizer can be easily bought on the world market, can't it?
Yes.
Unless Britain doesn't have enough money to make it worth it for their farmers because their farmers don't have pounds that are worth enough because nobody can pay their bills because I'm trying to say that when people try to price electricity this year in this year's money, or they want to price industrial services or how much it's worth to subsidize electricity for the poor, all these things where you try to use a currency based on a system of energy generation that was weather independent, it breaks down if your system of energy and economy is based on whether the weather cooperates. You don't know what pounds will be worth. You don't know how much your crops will be worth because people are buying it in pounds. I'm saying that the ability to predict the future, including through prices, is a result of having exceeded the boundaries of weather in modern industrial society.
And we've done that by harnessing hydrocarbons and nuclear. Is that and now they've lost the ability to assure stable supplies of fossil fuels and nuclear. And so you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that it's subverting their entire economic system. Is that what you're saying?
I've been made fun of on Twitter for calling it a potential degrowth spiral initiating event here. But let me say something that I experienced over my last 10 years, 11 years of going to Britain. My home away from home in many ways. British homes are not getting nicer. British infrastructure is barely improving. There are some new trains. There are some mega projects that are getting built, but like most of the power plants are crumbling, nuclear and otherwise, right? There's not an impression of increasing material wealth outside a few pockets of London that are growing rapidly. Now, in some ways, it's charming. A lot of places are stuck in time. But when I accompany that real world lived experience of being in Britain, of living in Britain, especially living in Britain on a student budget, with a chart showing a decline in electricity production and consumption year after year, I just can't get excited on the decarbonization numbers for Britain, where supposedly Britain was the only country that properly combined retaining its nuclear while increasing production of wind and solar and ensure there's some natural gas. A lot of the people in my own movement, in the pro-nuclear movement, who have exactly the same view of climate that I do, which is that it's a very important issue we should work on, cheered the closure of coal without any thinking about whether or not that coal was closing because its services were being replaced. And now it appears it wasn't. That whatever Britain needed from coal, it needs again today, and it doesn't have it.
And
and
it
it
can't
won't
build,
through
and
the
it
winter.
can't build it in anything like a time frame that makes any sense for this winter. And we're looking at, if there's a cold winter, then it is potentially disastrous. I mean, we've seen increases in natural gas prices there of 10-20% a day in some cases. I mean, these are frightening
Over
numbers.
all-time records.
Yes, over all-time records. So is going back to the question. So is Britain more screwed than other countries in Europe? I mean,
Yes, because it has a longer experience turning over absolute life or death infrastructure decisions on energy to market forces.
without a concern for resilience and reliability?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard it seems like every single CEO of Ofgem, that's the Office of Gas
Right.
and Electricity Markets, which is I don't know, the equivalent of what used to be like a major planner of making sure there were enough coal plants built or
Yeah.
whatever. They're always saying, hey guys, I know we love competitive markets and I do too, or I wouldn't have been appointed to this job, but there's not enough energy. And by next year, you will kind of have a risk. And the year after that, you'll have a bigger risk. By 5 years, don't know how we'll make it through a single 1 week cold spell. I was hearing those lectures back in my student days. In 2013, I heard a CEO of Ofgem give a speech to a tiny little audience just like before dinner at the hall in Pembroke College. And he was saying, oh, well, there is not enough and we look to be losing our gas storage. And if interconnectors go down and France uses its sovereign right to cut off the economic contracts promising delivery of this or that energy commodity, it claims it's right as a sovereign nation, we don't as the UK, then we won't have enough power. Any questions? And this was 2013, Robert.
Eight years ago, this was foreseen, or at least there was the possibility of this. So, but there's no possibility that they can begin drilling again to produce more gas in the North Sea, or I saw that the Holland is going to reopen the Groningen field as part of this net zero push. And yet Boris Johnson was apparently in New York just the other day saying, oh, net zero is carbon neutral. I mean, there just seems like this massive disconnect, not just in Europe, but in the US as well, between the reality of what is actually happening with the fragilization of the grid, increasing prices, and this idea that we're going to go to zero carbon outputs without any investment in nuclear or any understanding of what this does for affordability. It sounds like you're saying the same thing. Are we on the same page here?
Yeah, they thought they were doing decarbonization policy and they were doing degrowth policy. I mean, look, some things are okay. If you think there are painful lessons in store that lead to wisdom down the line, the UK government seems to be panic considering starting a whole raft of nuclear programs that some of us have been begging for years.
Well, let me ask about that, because that was one of the questions I wrote down. Is this potentially the catalyst then to get nuclear really on ramp in Britain and elsewhere? Because if this doesn't do it, I don't know what could possibly make them understand the stakes here. So the question is this going to be the catalyst that makes nuclear happen in Britain and elsewhere?
As yes, in Britain. Hopefully they still are able to execute it and afford it after this winter.
But would it be Sizewell, because the costs there are so enormous? Is it possible
What
SMRs?
costs? How do we say costs are enormous? The extra cost being paid by the economy for energy is going to total amount of Sizewell within a few months.
Well, that's a good point. But I guess the other question is that then about the scaling up. Would it make more sense at this point, even though they don't exist truly? They do not exist. There's no conveyor belt, no assembly system for building nuclear small reactors at scale. But is it possible SMRs could in 3, 4, 5 years come in here? I mean, in the best case scenario. I mean,
if you choose the wrong SMR developer, you're probably screwed. And certainly they're panic. I mean, the rumors are flying. Somebody at the Daily Mail gets their info from somebody who is a lobbyist or something for Rolls-Royce, and their Daily Mail keeps publishing the stories on Rolls-Royce's reactor being amazing and doing cool things and stuff. But I assume that if there's a panic build program, they would simultaneously announce a French Sizewell C thing plus a British, patriotic nuclear submarine tied SMR program or something like that. They'll just do everything. They'll sign whatever it takes to make it look like they are taking the crisis seriously. None of it will provide any extra kilowatt hours.
in the next six months or 18
winter.
months.
I mean, it's the
because
very
it can't.
definition of cold comfort, isn't it, at this point?
Nicely played there. Yes. So after Britain, is there another European country that is then facing a similar situation, or is it? Or
Well,
Britain is in it. Britain is in intensive.
Ireland is just down the line in
right.
every possible sense. The difference is Irish gas production is going up, and again, turns out that the secret to almost all these energy transitions are just having a lot of gas at the right time. So Ireland has a lot of gas, but they only, actually, interestingly, as far as I know, Ireland produces a bigger percentage of the gas it needs than Britain does of its own at the moment.
Huh. More self-sufficient, or provides enough of its own production. Well, so we talked about,
but Ireland is at the end of the line for electricity, and Ireland and the UK have had days recently where both grid operators have called each other in a panic, demanding everything they've got at any price.
And there's none to be had.
So they just sadly walk away and set the intertie to zero.
I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. What is
so the intertie, the cable between them two, if
right.
both sides get on the phone and say, I'm begging you, I need anything you've got at any price, and both sides are saying that.
Right, but they don't have any to
just cut
trade.
the cable for the day.
But they don't have any trade to do, so they don't. It nets out zero. Is that okay? I got you. So Ireland's in trouble. Who else? I mean, you went all over the continent. Germany, you said by the end of the year could be even further in bigger trouble than they are now.
Partly depends on whether they shut off the nuclear plants, and all of this also, we are just waiting to see whether the wind comes in. Is the wind gonna come in, or is it not? Some years it doesn't come in until next January or February. Some years the wind comes early. I don't know. It's time to literally rebuild temples to pagan gods, because that's how we do our energy planning now.
Hoping for favorable weather, which in this case would be wind.
If the German god provides, then maybe Britons who survive the winter will switch to that religion. I don't know. In the end, humans cry out for anything to make sense of a chaotic, disorderly world dominated by unfortunate and fortunate weather. People make fun of religions all the time as superstitions or this, but you need a lot emotionally to get through a world where you depend on the weather working to make your family survive. I don't begrudge anybody anything they believed before pre-modern times at all. Heck, now with the uncertainties facing us, it doesn't matter whether your God's real or not. You're going to need all of them to get through this winter.
Because if the weather turns foul and stays foul, we could see mass mortality events.
Careful. Foul is now determined by whether it does or doesn't produce enough renewable power.
Okay. By foul, I mean bitter cold.
But bitter cold accompanied with a constant steady wind over all of Europe at the same time is maybe doable a little bit because Europe's built so much wind capacity.
Right. But their only real option in terms of a fallback is going to be small oil-fired generation, or using
oil-fired
or
anything that burns. There's a reason why the forests have been regrowing for a few centuries in Europe, right?
So, okay. So anything that could burn. So
anything that can burn.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about Europe. I want to bring you back to the U.S. because I know you moved from California to Chicago. And I know about the recent, you worked hard and along with Matty Cherwinski and a bunch of other people on the Byron and Dresden plants. I haven't had a chance to write about that yet, but please update us. What happened and why did it happen? And why are you smiling about it? Because you deserve to.
Basically, the environmentalists blinked and they said, okay, to a delayed phase out of fossil fuels because they didn't have labor with them. They didn't have. There are nice ways and not nice ways to say this. Let me just put it this way.
But let me back up because I need to set the table here. I realize it. So the Byron and Dresden plants in Illinois are two nuclear plants that Exelon has said that they were going to close, and this was made clear more than a year ago. And they were slated for closure about now, and there was a big battle in the legislature. I just wanted to get that up front so people aren't familiar with what the politics and the situation on the ground in Illinois were. So anyway, please go ahead.
Exelon was not willing to commit to many hundreds of millions of dollars and a huge hiring spree to operate their plants for an extremely long period without knowing for sure they could get through the next 3 to 5 years without losing money.
Because they're a for-profit corporation.
They were willing to take
one of the biggest
risk
utilities in the country.
They were willing to take a risk that they messed up the plant operation. They were willing to take that risk. They were not willing to take the risk that they went for 95% of the time with a beautiful efficiency, securing the state's grid and energy supplies while losing money. And in the end, I wasn't going to go to Exelon and say, change your mind, become a nonprofit or something. Get donations from the same environmental nonprofits that say they care about carbon to take
Right.
losses and run your plant anyway. Yeah, no, I wasn't going to do that. Instead, they were going to close it, right? So we just had to deal with that. The question was whether and how much to subsidize those plants and what the political cost was going to be, what the bribe was going to be to those who didn't like nuclear in order to get them to do the right and basic thing for the economy, for labor, for the air, quite frankly.
Right.
And the question was, what cost was that going to be?
And the battle was in the Illinois legislature over what appropriations were going to be made. The subsidies needed to keep Byron and Dresden open. Is the subsidies?
Sure.
Call it what it is. The subsidies.
Most legislators, they know their family, they know their friends, they watch the news, blah blah blah. But that doesn't mean you know anything about the way electricity works.
Sure.
Almost nobody I talk to, no matter how sophisticated, seemed to have an understanding of what like a contract for difference was, or what upside and downside risk was, or like anything like that. I did talk to some folks who were, coming from the finance background before their public service, and they got it more quickly, but they still struggling to understand, wait, what are electricity markets? Why are they messing up the plants? If the plants are so good, why doesn't Exelon just do us a solid? And they just, the number of things you had to explain to give somebody a proper understanding of how we had arrived at the position of needing to save those plants and how to do it. It was just big. The basic thing was, if the plant shut down, you'll never decarbonize. Illinois, with the plants, can be cleaner than California in short order if you keep all the plants, uprate them, don't lose any. Right. And that they had to have intervention to save. And that if you wrote the intervention policy right, the taxpayer would make money on it. Exelon was willing to give up the windfall profits of any disruption, no matter how unforeseeable and unlikely, of higher gas prices. Exelon may already literally be losing money on that bill now, if the gas prices stay the way they are. And they're okay with that. They just didn't know for sure whether the gas prices were going to blow up.
Sure. But the
problem was demonstrating this to the folks in Chicago who say, my voters won't vote for something that just rewards big business for being profitable. Right. And you're like, we're talking about different things. The lights staying on, the coal plants going or staying. These are basic physical things. And you want to talk to me about the impression it does or doesn't make. I get it. They inhabit a political reality. Almost nobody knows about energy. Almost everybody's willing to defer to the energy lobbyists as long as it's wind and solar. And all the major
or the environmental
trying to kill nuclear.
Or the environmental groups who are trying to kill nuclear. But the net result here, the net result is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that because of your activism, other people getting motivated, the legislature passed a bill that has now been signed into law by Governor Pritzker, and Byron and Dresden have funding, and they're going to stay open, even though it was clear, and I doubted that they would be saved. I was not optimistic.
I told you it wasn't done.
I know. But so anyway, I'm taking this as a long way to get it. Congratulations. I mean, you worked hard and long on that, and against long odds, and you showed that nuclear plants, when the chips are down, they can be saved if the pressure points are applied in the right way. And
we showed that the wind and solar lobbies have to hire their enthusiasts, even though they've got the media on their side.
Right.
Until this winter. Everything we say, we have to say until this winter. But traditionally, all the media is on board without even needing to be paid, even though, a bunch are, by the wind and solar folks. They still have to pay citizens to care. They have to pay citizens to show up. And us nuclear fanatics, oh my God. There were times where, nuclear entities were scared that too much attention on the issue was bad because negotiations going bad or some shit like that. And, activists were ready to roll, and we rolled despite what the nuclear entities thought about, communicating with the public about the importance of nuclear. And
so
we just did it,
congrats.
and we just demonstrated. And there was, not only could we not be paid to be there, we couldn't be paid to stay away. That we were going to go, and we're going to show how much we love the nuclear plants, and we did. And then the unions, I mean, they showed up right after, same spot, right in front of Lincoln, same permitting process, same everything, and showed up with 500 strong union workers and families. One of the biggest demonstrations for nuclear in the history of the world. We're going to beat it in Berlin, but till then, it was one of the biggest demonstrations in the world for nuclear. And that showed the incredible popular power of nuclear. As a result, the ratio of subsidies going to other technologies versus nuclear only had to be 4 to 1 or so, 5 to 1. So for every dollar going to nuclear under the bill, if the prices went down, something like $5 is going to go to wind and solar. Now that the nuclear is going to give back money because the gas prices are so high, that ratio of the cost of the subsidy to nuclear versus the subsidy to wind and solar is going to balloon to like 10 to 1, 20 to 1. But whatever, you have to buy off wind and solar people. They are mercenaries, and they required that in order to vote for a basic bill that keeps the lights on in Chicago.
Well, just one quick reference point, as I pointed out, in 2018, when you look at CRS, Congressional Research Service data, in 2018, solar was getting 250 times more in terms of federal tax credits than nuclear, and wind was getting 160 times. So
now that's just one mechanism. There's also the state programs, and
sure.
that service would not have picked up on the subsidies that I don't wish we had to have subsidies for nuclear. That was just while Wall Street was burning $300 billion in the oil and gas fields, right?
Sure.
I'm not saying that it wasn't their right to go burn $300 billion in tight oil and gas plays. Just while they were willing to run a highly nonprofit gas industry, it was killing our nuclear plants. I'm not for subsidies. I'm for nuclear because it's the correct solution and it's the correct technology. We fought for subsidies until Wall Street turned off the cash. Right. Now that Wall Street turned off the cash, we still had a lag period until the panic hit. And that's the period that was killing off Byron and Dresden. We got to the end of that period right as we saved Byron and Dresden, right?
Where gas prices are starting to rise because the cash tap has been turned off in the shale fields.
They are demanding, shockingly, they're demanding that oil and gas pay for itself.
Right. So I know we've been about an hour here, Mark, and my guest is Mark Nelson. He's the managing director at the Radiant Energy Fund. You can find him on Twitter at EnergyBants. I know you need to run because we've been talking for right at an hour and that's longer than we agreed to. So I know I've asked you in the past, what are you reading? I'm just quickly, what's on your bookshelf, or have you had time? You've been dashing around the globe. Any books that are in hand or on your Kindle? What are they?
So I work myself kind of to death, but my rule on flights is that I don't buy internet. I just use it to unplug. And that's one of the main times I read right now. And I don't do Kindle. I take a physical book because it reminds me, the weight reminds me of what I'm not reading.
Attaboy. I love me a good printed book.
Yeah, exactly. Currently I'm reading an extraordinary book about the occupation and rebuilding of Japan by the United States after World War II.
What's it called?
It's called, I gotta grab it. I don't stare at the cover much. I'll get it to you and your readers. But it was published about 25 years ago by a professor at MIT, John Gower, I believe. Anyway,
okay.
If I remember before the end of my pitch for it, I'll let you guys know.
Okay.
The most interesting thing for me is that my grandfather, after graduating with his engineering degree from Oklahoma State, was drafted straight into the Army and went straight to Japan as a young man in 1946, not 1945. And he would have witnessed a lot of the world seen in that book, but he never really shared with my uncles and dad. Family didn't know much, and now he's not here to tell us. I'm sort of rebuilding the experience he must have had in Japan through this extraordinary book. Things like how the Constitution got written. Things like how the aftermath of having been bombed by your new occupier that you now celebrate working with, that both the fire bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's a spiritual struggle that's just, we don't think about very much.
Yeah.
And yet it's obvious that something went right in Japan. Where did it come from? How did it come from? Is there a difference between what works and what's moral? The retention of the emperor, that was itself a fascinating story, where much of Japanese society was calling for something like at minimum, a changeover from the emperor who led the war to one who didn't. And it didn't happen because the absolutely key personal intervention of MacArthur himself, because he was convinced that only the retention of that single guy as emperor would lead to a peaceful occupation and early exit. Whether it's right or wrong, the book leaves in question. It's just something that happened. And the reconstruction of history after that is something that Japan's still struggling with today as it deals with an aggressive neighbor, nuclear restarts, armaments of various kinds.
Right. Huh. Fascinating. So last question, what gives you hope?
So since we've talked last, I just witnessed on the streets of Brussels nuclear advocates from 12 different countries, minimum, converting people on the spot through their joy and enthusiasm. I admit it was very fun to be able to shout out a little speech to the crowd, illustrating that we just won in Illinois, and that if it's possible to win there, we can win anywhere, and that you just have to keep up the faith, keep the analyses good, keep organized, stay active, don't backstab, just keep moving and stay brave during the energy crisis this winter, and we will be able to stop and reverse a bunch of these nuclear phase-outs. These nuclear phase-outs were decided on by weak and pathetic politicians in times where the land flowed with milk and honey and mistakes and consequences didn't matter. These times have changed. We're in times of consequence, and I believe we're going to have leaders rise to the occasion, and we'll be there right there to quickly get them up to speed on energy, to get them up to speed on what exactly the nuclear plants have been doing that's so amazing. We're going to save a lot of these things that people say there's no chance to save, Robert. We're going to do it.
Well, Diablo Canyon's next on the list, I hope.
Talk about that soon.
Fair enough. Well, great, Mark. I'll let you go. My guest, again, has been Mark Nelson. He's with the Radiant Energy Fund. He's the managing director there. You can find him on Twitter at EnergyBants. That's Energy, B-A-N-T-S. Mark, thanks a million for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Great to be here, Robert. I expect I'll see you soon.
I hope so. Thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.